Marcus Washington had always been a boy who carried the weight of his heritage with quiet dignity, a young man whose life was steeped in the traditions of hard work and honor on his family's modest farm in rural Louisiana. On that fateful morning at Lincoln West Middle School in Baton Rouge, the sound of the ringing bell was not just a signal for class to begin, but a prelude to a storm that would forever alter his life. As the corridors filled with excited chatter about last night's football game and the promise of a hearty lunch, Marcus quietly steeled himself for the day ahead. Unlike many of his peers who spent their weekends immersed in video games, he had already risen at sunrise to help his father tend to their acres of soybeans, corn, and a handful of cattle. He learned the art of crop rotation and the secrets hidden in the shifting winds that warned of approaching storms, a legacy of resilience passed down through generations. That day in Mr. Bradley Whitmore's 7th grade science class, the lesson on American agriculture was meant to be a routine academic exercise, yet it quickly transformed into a battleground for truth and prejudice. Mr. Whitmore, a man in his mid-40s with a stocky build and a habit of adjusting his glasses as if each adjustment reaffirmed his authority, began the class by distributing worksheets. Today, we are going to discuss farming techniques, both traditional and modern, he announced, in a measured tone that carried the weight of unquestionable certainty. Marcus flipped through the worksheet and immediately noticed glaring errors, outdated information on soil rotation, a superficial take on irrigation methods, and a dismissive assertion that small farms were vanishing under the relentless march of corporate agriculture. For Marcus, whose family still thrived by embracing innovation and honoring tradition, these inaccuracies were not just factual errors, they were a slight against his way of life. When Marcus raised his hand to speak up, his voice was calm but resolute. "That isn't entirely true," he said, his tone respectful yet firm. "My family uses modern techniques like precision farming, drones, soil sensors, and GPS-guided tractors. We are innovating, not disappearing." His words, meant to clarify and correct, struck a nerve with Mr. Whitmore. The teacher's face hardened as he retorted, "Marcus, I appreciate your input, but we follow the curriculum. If you have concerns, we can discuss them after class." The classroom buzzed with whispers and a few snickers from classmates who, perhaps influenced by ingrained prejudices, doubted the worth of a young black boy's perspective. In that moment, the classroom became a microcosm of a larger societal issue, one where the truth was often suppressed by a system steeped in racial bias and outdated authority. The tension escalated rapidly. Marcus felt a deep injustice, not merely because his facts were being dismissed, but because he was being silenced for speaking his truth. His protest was met with a cold dismissal. "We expect you to follow the rules and complete your worksheet," Mr. Whitmore commanded, in a voice that brooked no argument. Marcus's heart pounded as he realized that his attempt to defend his family's legacy had been twisted into an act of defiance. In that charged moment, every whispered snicker and every sidelong glance from his peers felt like a confirmation of a bitter reality. The world was not ready to accept the strength of his convictions, particularly when they challenged the status quo. As Marcus trudged down the hallway, the polished tile floor echoed the sound of his sneakers, a steady rhythm that underscored the gravity of what had just transpired. The air seemed heavier, laden with an unspoken mix of anger and disbelief. He was not a troublemaker by nature. He was a boy with a deep-seated commitment to truth and tradition, a commitment that set him apart in a system that too often rewarded conformity over courage. When he reached the principal's office, he was met by Mrs. Dunbar, whose sharp gaze and clipped words signaled that the outcome had already been decided. The sterile office, redolent of old books and lemon-scented cleaner, became the stage for a confrontation that was as much about personal integrity as it was about institutional power. Inside the office, Principal Harold Easton, a man with graying hair and deeply etched lines of experience, attempted to mediate the situation. "Marcus, can you explain what happened?" he inquired, his tone weary yet sincere. Marcus recounted the incident with a blend of frustration and determination. "I was simply correcting the misinformation in class. My family has built our legacy on truth and hard work, and I won't let false narratives diminish that." But the principal, constrained by the rigid framework of school rules, insisted that respect for authority was paramount. even when that authority was steeped in prejudice and stubborn tradition. "There is a time and place for discussions like this," Easton said gently, though his eyes betrayed a reluctance to fully support Marcus's honesty. The situation took a darker turn when Mr. Whitmore re-entered the room, his presence a tangible reminder of the deep-seated discrimination that pervaded the institution. His words were laced with condescension. "This is not about whether you are right or wrong, Marcus. It is about following the rules," he said in a tone that chilled Marcus to the core. In that moment, the cruelty of the system became painfully clear. A system where a young man's insistence on truth was punished with the severity of suspension. With a heavy heart and clenched fists, Marcus was told he must leave school for the rest of the day. A decision that felt less like discipline and more like a punitive measure aimed at stifling his voice because of his background. When Marcus's mother, Tasha Washington, arrived at the office, her expression was a mask of stoic disappointment rather than anger. The silence that hung between them was as heavy as the humid Louisiana air. On the car ride home, Tasha's voice broke the silence, questioning the injustice of it all. "How can they punish you for speaking the truth?" she asked softly. Marcus could only look out the window, the passing scenery a blur of green fields and dusty roads, as he silently vowed that this was not the end of his fight. At the farmhouse, the tension continued to mount. His father, Terence Washington, a broad-shouldered man whose rough hands told stories of decades spent working the land, awaited him with a furrowed brow. Before any words could be exchanged, a deep, resonant voice from the porch halted all conversation. Marcus's grandfather, Ezekiel Washington, a retired military veteran whose stature was as commanding as his presence, emerged into view. His 6'4" frame and sharply trimmed silver beard made it clear that he was a man who had weathered many storms in his life. "They want to treat my grandson like a delinquent," Ezekiel declared, his voice echoing with a promise of retribution. His eyes burned with a quiet fury that spoke volumes of a lifetime of battles fought against injustice and racial discrimination. Ezekiel's words sent a chill down Marcus's spine, not because they instilled fear, but because they heralded the beginning of a grander plan. A plan of retribution that would shake the very foundations of Lincoln West Middle School. "Tomorrow we will send a message they will never forget," Ezekiel vowed. His declaration was not merely about personal revenge, it was an emphatic stand against a system that had long marginalized those who dared to speak the truth. The promise of this coming reckoning filled Marcus with a blend of hope and trepidation, knowing that the path ahead would be fought with further challenges and sacrifices. That night, as Marcus lay in bed unable to sleep, every moment of the day replayed in his mind like a relentless drumbeat. The cold, dismissive stare of Mr. Whitmore, the condescending tone of Principal Easton, and the heavy silence of his own family, all converged into a painful reminder of how deeply the wounds of racial injustice could cut. Yet, even in the midst of his sorrow and isolation, there flickered a spark of defiance. Marcus knew that he was not alone. His family's legacy of resilience was a beacon that had carried them through generations of hardship, and it would carry him forward into a future where his voice would no longer be silenced. In that quiet, somber night, the resolve within Marcus began to harden. The humiliation he suffered in that sterile office, the cruelty of a system that punished truth, and the unyielding determination in his grandfather's eyes, all of it coalesced into a vow of retribution that promised to be as spectacular as it was just. He realized that his struggle was not merely a personal battle, but a fight against a world that too often devalued his worth because of the color of his skin. The injustice he experienced that day was emblematic of a larger societal failing, a failing that demanded a response both bold and magnificent. And so, with the first light of dawn, Marcus Washington would rise not as a defeated student, but as a young man emboldened by the fierce love and unwavering support of his family. His journey was only just beginning, and though the road ahead was steeped in the shadows of injustice, the promise of a resounding comeback, one that would make even the most hardened critics sit up in awe, burned brightly in his heart. The legacy of his ancestors, forged in the crucible of struggle and tempered by the desire for justice, would not be denied. Instead, It would blaze forth in a retribution so grand that the very name Ezekiel Washington would come to symbolize a turning point, a moment when the oppressed found the courage to rise and reclaim their dignity in a world that had long refused to see their worth. Marcus Washington had always carried the weight of his family's legacy with quiet dignity, a legacy forged in the red clay of rural Louisiana and passed down through generations of hard work and honor. On that fateful morning at Lincoln West Middle School in Baton Rouge, the ringing bell did more than call students to class. It signaled the start of a confrontation that would upend the established order. While other kids chattered excitedly about last night's football game and the day's lunch menu, Marcus was already bracing himself for what he knew would be an uphill battle against prejudice and outdated authority. Unlike his peers who spent their weekends lost in video games, Marcus had long been immersed in the traditions of his family's farm. From sunrise, he helped his father, Terence Washington, tend to acres of soybeans, corn, and a modest herd of cattle. He learned to read the whisper of the wind as a warning of an oncoming storm, and to respect the rhythms of nature that had sustained his ancestors for decades. In Mr. Bradley Whitmore's 7th grade science class, the lesson on American agriculture was supposed to be routine. Yet, as Mr. Whitmore, a man whose stern demeanor and stocky frame radiated authority, distributed worksheets, Marcus immediately spotted the glaring errors. The section on soil rotation was outdated, the discussion of irrigation incomplete, and the assertion that small farms were doomed to disappear beneath the weight of corporate agriculture was a blatant misrepresentation. Marcus knew better. With a calm determination that belied the storm inside him, he raised his hand and said, "That isn't entirely true. My family uses modern techniques like precision farming, drones, soil sensors, and GPS-guided tractors. We are not disappearing, we're innovating." His words, meant to correct a false narrative, were met with sneers and whispers from classmates steeped in prejudice. Mr. Whitmore's face darkened as he dismissed Marcus's input, insisting that the class adhere strictly to the curriculum. The teacher's condescending tone and the dismissive laughter of his peers cut deep, revealing an undercurrent of racial discrimination that stung all the more because Marcus' truth came from a place of lived experience. The tension in the classroom quickly escalated. When Marcus continued to insist that the textbook was wrong, his words were met not with dialogue, but with a cold decree. If he couldn't follow the rules, he would have to leave. The classroom's energy shifted from hushed murmurs to a palpable sense of injustice. Marcus, his heart pounding with both defiance and sorrow, walked out of class, his fists clenching at the humiliation and the systemic bias that had rendered his voice insignificant. In the sterile principal's office, the air was heavy with the scent of old books and lemon-scented cleaner as Principal Harold Easton and Mrs. Dunbar delivered their verdict. Suspension for speaking the truth in a room that was supposed to be a sanctuary for learning. A punishment not for disruption, but for challenging an oppressive narrative. The moment was a bitter reminder of how institutions often silenced voices that dared to question authority. At home, the atmosphere was no less tense. Over an untouched breakfast, Marcus's mother, Tasha Washington, paced the kitchen, her eyes filled with a mix of worry and exasperation. "I don't understand how this escalated," she murmured, her voice trembling with both anger and sorrow as she clutched her phone. Terence Washington sipped his coffee in stoic silence, his rugged face betraying nothing of the internal storm. It was then that Marcus's grandfather, Ezekiel Washington, a towering figure whose wealth had been built through smart investments in land and agriculture, transforming a modest farm into a thriving empire, rose from his seat at the head of the table. Calm and deliberate, Ezekiel's deep voice cut through the tension as he said, "Marcus, put on a clean shirt. You're coming with me." Shock and confusion flickered across Marcus's face as he asked, "Where?" His grandfather merely smiled slowly and replied, "To school." Before Marcus could muster another word, a deep, distant rumble reverberated outside. Terence set his coffee mug down as Ezekiel pushed back his chair and strode to the front door. Marcus darted after him, flinging open the door just in time to see a sleek black helicopter slicing through the sky. The aircraft descended with a power that made the very ground tremble, its rotors whipping up dust and scattering leaves across the family's fields. Marcus's heart pounded as he watched his grandfather step out onto the porch, adjusting his cufflinks with the same unyielding calm that had earned him both respect and fear in town. "We're sending a message today," Ezekiel declared, his tone leaving no room for doubt. Tasha's brow furrowed as she pleaded softly, "Daddy, is this really necessary?" But Ezekiel's response was resolute. "You want your son to learn to keep his mouth shut when he knows he's right?" "I don't think so." Without a moment's hesitation, Ezekiel led Marcus toward the helicopter. Inside, the engine roared to life, and as the ground receded beneath them, Marcus's stomach churned with anxiety and anticipation. Today, they weren't just showing up at school. They were making an entrance that would leave no one indifferent. At Lincoln West Middle School, the arrival of the helicopter created an immediate uproar. Principal Easton, who had barely managed a quiet moment with his morning coffee, was jolted from his seat by the urgent voice of Mrs. Dunbar. "Sir, there's a helicopter landing on the football field." Easton rushed to the window, his face blanching as he beheld the sight of the black helicopter touching down in the center of the field, its blades stirring up clouds of dust and debris. In that surreal moment, all eyes in the school turned toward the spectacle. Ezekiel Washington emerged from the helicopter with an air of authority that silenced even the most skeptical whispers. His polished boots crunched against the grass as he strode across the field, Marcus trailing behind with his backpack clutched tightly to his side. Students pressed against the windows, phones in hand, recording every moment of the unfolding drama. Security guards hurried to intercept him, but Ezekiel's presence alone commanded respect and hesitation. Principal Easton, red-faced and flustered, stormed out to confront him. "Mr. Washington, what is the meaning of this?" he demanded over the fading hum of the helicopter. With unshaken calm, Ezekiel replied, "The meaning is simple. My grandson was expelled from this school for speaking the truth about our way of life, a truth that your curriculum has long distorted, and that, sir, simply does not sit right with me." Easton's face betrayed a mix of anger and uncertainty, knowing that this was no ordinary parental intervention. Inside the main office, the tension reached a boiling point. Seated before Principal Easton's desk, Ezekiel Washington and Marcus faced the principal and a visibly agitated Mr. Whitmore, who now stood near the filing cabinets with crossed arms. Ezekiel's voice was measured yet cutting as he demanded, "I want to hear it from you, Mr. Whitmore. Tell me why you felt the need to kick my grandson out of class." Mr. Whitmore stammered, insisting that Marcus had been disruptive and had refused to follow instructions. "A child correcting false information in class is not a disruption," Ezekiel countered, his tone laced with controlled fury. "It is a challenge to your authority, a challenge that you chose to suppress instead of encourage. You treated Marcus not as a student but as a problem to be managed, all because his skin and his truth threatened your outdated system." Principal Easton tried to interject, but Ezekiel's words left him momentarily speechless. As the argument unfolded, it became clear that this was not merely about a classroom dispute. It was about control, power, and the unwillingness of those in authority to accept that even a young man from a small farm could possess knowledge and passion. Ezekiel's calm yet incisive dismantling of the school's justification for punishment resonated throughout the room. "If you truly understood the purpose of a classroom," he said softly, "you would know that it is meant for learning and growth, not for silencing those who dare to speak up." His words, delivered with the authority of a man who had fought battles both on and off the field, struck a chord with everyone present. The entire episode, broadcast by social media and whispered about in hallways, sent shockwaves through the community. It was a reckoning, a resounding declaration that disrespect and injustice would no longer be tolerated. In that moment, Marcus Washington, though still trembling with the weight of humiliation and the sting of racial bias, felt a surge of vindication. His grandfather's grand entrance and unwavering stand had transformed his personal punishment into a public outcry against a system that had long devalued his worth. The school, the community, and even those who had once sneered at his courage were forced to reckon with the truth. A young man's quest for knowledge and dignity was a battle worth fighting, and the reverberations of this day would be felt far beyond the walls of Lincoln West Middle School. Marcus Washington had never seen an adult rendered speechless quite like that day in the principal's office. Mr. Whitmore's face burned with a mixture of shame and indignation as his words faltered. "I didn't mean any harm," he stuttered, though his tone betrayed that his intentions were far more self-serving than he cared to admit. The room fell into a heavy silence as Ezekiel Washington leaned forward, locking eyes with him so intently that it was as if he were peering into Whitmore's very soul. "Maybe not, but harm was done regardless," Ezekiel said, his voice low and deliberate, each syllable laced with the quiet fury of a man who had fought his entire life against injustice. Principal Harold Easton, tapping his pen against his desk in a futile attempt to fill the void, finally broke the silence. "Mr. Washington, I want to resolve this matter. What exactly are you asking for?" he asked, his tone a blend of forced calm and underlying anxiety. Ezekiel exhaled slowly, his expression unwavering as he laid out his demands. "First, Marcus goes back to class today with not a single mark blemishing his record. He should be allowed to resume his studies as if nothing had happened." Easton nodded slowly, the weight of the decision clearly pressing upon him, as if he could already sense the public storm brewing just beyond the school's polished walls. Ezekiel raised a second finger, his eyes never leaving the principal's. "Second, I expect a formal apology from you and from Mr. Whitmore." Marcus was not disruptive. He was simply trying to set the record straight in a classroom that has long turned a blind eye to the truth. At the mention of an apology, Marcus's breath hitched. The idea that a teacher, a man entrusted with the education of children, would have to grovel for forgiveness made his heart sink. Whitmore's face twisted in anger, his voice rising as he protested. "An apology? That is completely unnecessary." Ezekiel merely shrugged his broad shoulders, his tone growing sterner. "Then I'll have no choice but to get in touch with the school board. I have friends there, you know, and I am fully prepared to make a few calls to local reporters. Tell me, have you ever seen what happens when a school tries to silence a black student who is merely telling the truth?" At that moment, Principal Easton stiffened visibly, and Whitmore's throat bobbed as he swallowed hard. Marcus could almost hear the gears turning in their heads as they realized Ezekiel was giving them a choice that wasn't really optional. Either they did the right thing now, quietly and without fanfare, or they would be forced to do so later when the full weight of public scrutiny came crashing down upon them. After a long charged pause, Mr. Whitmore looked over at Easton, then back at Ezekiel, his expression a mix of resignation and barely concealed fear. With a heavy sigh, he finally relented. "Fine." The word hung in the air like a reluctant truce. Ezekiel turned his piercing gaze to Principal Easton, who adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat before speaking. "Marcus, we shouldn't have rushed to judgment," he said slowly, his voice carrying an air of forced contrition. "I apologize." Marcus sat there, frozen, not quite sure whether he was in shock or simply waiting for someone to confirm that he wasn't dreaming. It was a moment that felt both surreal and painfully satisfying, a moment when the scales of injustice seemed to tip, even if just a fraction. Then, with a heavy exhale, Mr. Whitmore's hands clenched as if it were physically painful for him to utter the words he knew he owed. "Marcus, I'm sorry," he said through gritted teeth, his voice barely audible but heavy with the weight of his unspoken misdeeds. Marcus did not respond, not because he couldn't, but because in that moment, for the first time, he realized that the apology was not just for him. It was a public admission that the system had failed him. Ezekiel clapped his hands together sharply, breaking the tension. "Good. Now that we've settled that," he announced, rising from his chair so that his tall, commanding presence loomed over the desk, "I will be keeping a close eye on this school. If anything like this happens again, I won't be coming alone." Easton's brows pulled together and he asked, "Is that a threat?" With a sly grin, Ezekiel replied, "Nah, it's a promise." Marcus gathered his backpack as his grandfather turned to him. "Come on, boy, let's get you back to class." And just like that, the meeting was over. As Marcus walked down the hallway, every pair of eyes was fixed on him. Students whispered and speculated, some nodded in approval, while others simply stared in disbelief. Marcus wasn't sure if they now saw him with newfound respect, or simply shock at the spectacle they had witnessed that morning. Yet, for the first time in what felt like an eternity, he knew that he had won a small victory in a battle that was far larger than any one classroom dispute. Stepping back into the classroom, Marcus slid into his seat with a sense of liberation and relief. The room was quiet, the air heavy with the unspoken acknowledgement of what had just transpired. Some students eyed him cautiously, while others grinned as if they had just witnessed the greatest showdown in the history of Lincoln West Middle School. A few even offered him a nod of respect, a gesture that said, "I saw what you did today, and I know it took guts." In that moment, Marcus realized that his act of standing up for the truth was not just a personal triumph. It was a beacon for every child who had ever been told to keep quiet simply because they did not fit the mold. Mr. Whitmore stood at the front of the class, gripping his textbook a little too tightly, his eyes fixed on Marcus with a mixture of resentment and regret. He said nothing, nor did he acknowledge Marcus's return, but that was no longer important to Marcus, because everyone in that room, from the teachers peeking through blinds to the students recording the moment on their phones, knew what had happened. It was a defining moment, a moment when the oppressive structures of racism and outdated authority were challenged by the truth and courage of one young man. It was a message that resonated far beyond the walls of Lincoln West Middle School. Marcus had made sure that his stand, his refusal to be silenced by a system steeped in outdated authority and racial prejudice, would echo in the hearts and minds of countless others. His act of defiance was not merely a personal victory, it was a clarion call to every child who had ever felt the sting of discrimination, every student who had ever been dismissed or ridiculed for speaking out. In his quiet, determined way, Marcus had shown that knowledge is not only power, it is a weapon, and when wielded with courage and conviction, it can change the world. As evening descended over Baton Rouge, the echoes of that tumultuous day lingered like the fading light of a sunset. Parents at local diners, particularly those seasoned ladies who had seen decades of change in their beloved community, discussed the incident in hushed tones over cups of coffee and slices of pie. They recalled the days when respect and decency were the order of the day, and felt a pang of sorrow at how far society had strayed. Yet, amidst that sorrow was a glimmer of hope. Hope that perhaps the courage of one young man could inspire a movement for change. At home, Marcus lay in bed, the events of the day replaying in his mind like an old film strip. He remembered every moment, the humiliation of being silenced, the bitterness in Mr. Whitmore's eyes, the stern words of Principal Easton, and most of all, the steady, resolute presence of his grandfather. Ezekiel had not only defended Marcus, he had challenged an entire system that had long marginalized voices like his. And though Marcus felt the sting of unfair punishment and the weight of an unjust world, he also felt the warmth of his family's love and the strength of their support. In the quiet of that late hour, Marcus promised himself that he would never again allow anyone to dismiss his truth or belittle his heritage. He understood now that while words could ignite change, it was the courage to act that truly set one apart. His stand that day was not an isolated act of defiance. It was the spark that would light a fire in the hearts of many who had long suffered under the yoke of discrimination and outdated traditions. And so, with the promise of a new day dawning over Louisiana, Marcus Washington prepared to return to school not as a victim, but as a trailblazer. His experience had taught him that when people are underestimated and oppressed, they must rise up with a dignity that is both fierce and unyielding. His quiet rebellion had become a rallying cry, a testament to the idea that truth, when spoken boldly and backed by unwavering conviction, could dismantle even the most entrenched systems of injustice. In that spirit, Marcus looked forward to the future with a sense of calm determination. He knew that every step he took in that school corridor, every whispered word of encouragement from his peers, and every stern glance from a teacher would be a reminder that he was not alone in his fight. The legacy of his family, the lessons of the land, and the wisdom of his grandfather had all combined to form a shield against the cruelty of the world. And as long as he carried that shield, no force, no matter how cruel or oppressive, could silence his voice again. That day, as the sun dipped lower in the sky and the familiar hum of life resumed around him, Marcus Washington emerged not as a broken or defeated boy, but as a symbol of resilience and hope. His journey had just begun, and he was ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead with the quiet power of truth as his guiding light. In every lesson taught, every whispered conversation, and every act of defiance, his story would serve as a reminder that, when you stand up for what is right, you hold the power to change the world for the better.